Ideology Explained. Episode 2. What is a concept? Hello, and welcome to Ideology Explained, a series that seeks to provide definitions of, background to, and greater familiarity with some of the most common ideas, concepts, and abstract terminology we use in everyday conversation. Introductory remarks. This episode is intended to serve as a companion or counterpart of sorts to the first episode in the series, which focused on what is meant by the term idea. Those of you who were kind enough to listen to the content of the first episode will have no doubt become alert to how often the terms idea and concept were used either concurrently or synonymously. Indeed, on one occasion in that episode, I was required to announce a terminological clarification when a theorist used the word concept to mean something similar to what all other theorists in that episode referred to as ideas. For this reason, and many others besides, I thought it would be useful to explore the notion of a concept in greater detail and consider how this term distinguishes itself from that of an idea. Since I do not want to rehearse material already covered in the last episode, it will be important to only cover material and theories in which there is a clear distinction between the terms concept and idea, in the sense that the terms have a discrete meaning or understanding independent of one another. For a similar reason, we will not be considering schools of thought for which the notion of a concept either lacks meaning or else a systematic exposition of a concept in the abstract is considered less important than the practical implication of certain fundamental and foundational concepts. Listeners who recall the narrative in the first episode with respect to Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Ubuntu will understand why these traditions will not feature in this episode, given that their attitude toward concepts flows from the same first principles as does their characterization of ideas. Whilst it is not necessary for you to have listened to the first episode of this series in order to benefit from the contents of the present one, it is recommended that the parts relating to how the notion of an idea has been analyzed in the Western philosophical tradition is listened to. The contrasting characterizations of an idea as either an object of the senses or else an object of the intellect will be of some use in understanding the analyses of the notion of a concept in this episode. To briefly explain why this is, for those listeners familiar with philosophical terminology, and to the extent there is a clear distinction to be made between the terms idea and concept, whereas the first episode could be taken to be more concerned with metaphysics, which is the study of reality, this episode is decidedly more concerned with epistemology, the study of knowledge. To put it another way, if both ideas and concepts are taken to be types of mental representation, or constructs, whereas the first episode considered the origin of these mental representations and constructs, this episode considers instead their intrinsic nature and supposed function. Moreover, because I do not want to begin every episode of this series with remarks to the effect that our earliest reflections on the meaning of the subject matter of that particular episode can be traced to ancient Greece, this episode will proceed directly to more modern scholarship on the notion of a concept. Yet it is worth stating in this introduction that this focus on the intrinsic nature or essence of a concept is a tradition that was greatly influenced by the contribution of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates to the history of Western philosophical inquiry. In his search for universal definitions of key concepts such as justice and virtue, Socrates was much more interested in capturing the true essence of what these concepts meant rather than merely detailing particular instances of them. To this end, Socrates wanted to attain definitions that were objective and emergent from rational inquiry rather than those that stemmed from subjective opinion, individual assumption, or reduced to no more than mere empirical instances. As we will shortly go on to learn, an emphasis on either rational inquiry or else empirical observation in terms of understanding the essential nature of concepts is of tremendous importance in delineating different schools of thought in Western philosophy on the subject matter. Indeed, the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, whose respective theories of ideas were examined in the previous episode, advocate in favor of contrasting points of view in this regard, the supremacy of rational inquiry being championed by Plato, whereas the tangibility and testability of empirical observation promoted by Aristotle. Here again, we encounter two archetypal polar perspectives in the Western philosophical tradition, on this occasion with respect to the intrinsic nature of concepts, rationalism and empiricism. To be clear, championing the centrality of rational inquiry in terms of defining the essential nature of certain concepts does not, of itself, restrict a theorist from accepting the importance of empirical observation in the formulation of certain other concepts. Likewise, a theorist who argues that empirical data must fundamentally ground the formulation and analysis of concepts is not precluded from also accepting the critical importance of rational inquiry in structuring and deducing concepts. The distinction and debate in its most divergent manner of expression relates to whether there are any concepts that can credit for their origin rational inquiry alone, and whether there is any limit to the concepts that can be formulated by means of sensory experience alone. In contemporary philosophy and cognitive science, there is a broad acceptance that rationalism and empiricism are complementary, and each approach plays a role in the proliferation of concepts. However, an understanding of the rationalist-empiricist debate provides a great deal of insight into some foundational themes relevant to the central question of this episode: what is a concept? Part 1. Early Modern Philosophy. An appropriate theorist to begin our exploration of the notion of a concept is the figure who is widely accredited with ushering in modern philosophy, the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. Although Descartes uses the term idea throughout his work, insofar as his attempt to categorize them relates to their intrinsic nature, his analysis of mental constructs corresponds quite well with the term concept in the sense in which we are using the notion for the purposes of this episode. Upon surveying the types of mental constructs, concepts, that exist within the human mind, Descartes concludes that there are some concepts that cannot be derived from sensory experience, or even constructed by the imagination, because the imagination uses sensory data for these purposes, but rather these concepts must be innate or intrinsic to the human intellect. This is either because there is nothing within our range of sensory experience that resembles these concepts, the concept of infinity being an example, or else it is because these concepts are so clear and distinct within the mind they cannot depend for their existence on our inherently unreliable sensory apparatus. Indeed, as Descartes famously argues, even were our senses to be deceived, for instance by some all-powerful evil demon, the truth, clarity, and distinction of these concepts would remain indubitable. The concept of self-existence is one such example. The fact of a thinking being is revealed by the act of thinking itself, without any need to rely upon the senses or derive anything from sensory experience. Rational inquiry is all that is required to reveal these innate concepts. The clear and distinct criterion for the identification of an innate concept is central to understanding Descartes' rational argument. A concept is clear when it is immediately present in the mind without confusion. Self-existence is clear because thought requires a thinking self. Even the act of doubting requires the existence of a doubter. A concept is distinct when it is separated from all other concepts, containing only what is necessary for its essence, without ambiguity or uncertainty. A triangle having three sides is distinct because, by definition, a shape with three sides is known as a triangle. In this way, Descartes' appeal to the clear and distinct criterion is a means by which to establish certain and indubitable knowledge, undeniable truths that form the basis of knowledge immune from the vagaries and fallibility of sensory experience. Another figure who played a foundational role in establishing modern philosophy was the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. In stark contrast to Descartes, Hobbes was decidedly committed to the notion that all concepts are mental representations derived solely from sensory experience. Indeed, for Hobbes, even thought itself was no more than a physical process in the brain, with all concepts being ultimately reducible to sensory encounters of one form or another. The residual effect of sensory perception, which is the lingering image of an object that was once part of a sensory encounter, but a weaker version of the original sensation, being what we refer to as memory, and a recombination of these images into more complex concepts, being what we refer to as imagination. As it is probably evident, Hobbes very much argued in favor of an empiricist understanding of concepts, which is to say, one that rejected innate concepts, given his belief in the reducibility of all knowledge to sensory experience. Unlike the view espoused by Descartes, that the indubitable clarity and distinctness of certain concepts suggested that they could not have originated from sensory experience, Hobbes argued that all concepts could be accounted for as products of a mechanical or computational process of thought in the brain, thought being a physical process in this context. Hobbes's computational process of rational inquiry was closely tied to language in his system, with words being arbitrary signs or symbols standing for the mental representations human beings formed as a result of sensory experience. The subsequent manipulation of these symbols, using logical rules in a similar fashion as the utilization of mathematical operations, yields a structured and organized system of concepts. Complex concepts then become no more than a mechanism by which individuals categorize and systematize their experiences, with precise definitions therefore being essential for clear reasoning, and ambiguous or misleading terminology being the basis for distortions in the analysis of concepts by means of rational inquiry. The contributions of Descartes and Hobbes provide good outlines of the difference in the approach of rationalism and empiricism toward the intrinsic nature of concepts. For rationalists, an appeal to innate concepts is driven principally by the recognition that there appears to be a certain species of concept whose truth and certainty is self-evident and does not require any appeal to sensory experience. For empiricists, since all constructs within the mind ultimately originate from sensory experience, concepts of any and all types or kinds must in some way be reducible to sensory encounters and instances of perception. The influence of these two approaches had a profound impact on the progress of philosophical inquiry in the early modern period. We shall now consider some representative theories to familiarize ourselves with the distinction between these two schools of thought within the Western philosophical tradition, one each for the polar perspectives, and then we will revisit the work of a theorist who attempted to reconcile them. Part 2. Representative theories. Let us begin with the contribution to Western philosophy of the German mathematician and scientist Gottfried Leibniz. His theory of concepts is incredibly important for understanding the rationalist school of thought, and his work would have profound implications for the study of logic in the centuries since his time. In order to understand Leibniz's characterization of the intrinsic nature of concepts, we must first understand the distinction between a subject and a predicate. A subject is meant in more or less the same way we are familiar with, as a complete individual substance or a noun. A predicate is then a quality, property, or relation contained within, possessed by, or belonging to a given subject. It can be true or false that a particular predicate belongs to a given subject, but, naturally, a true proposition requires that the predicate does in fact belong to the specified subject. Leibniz, then, defines a concept as a structured mental representation containing the predicates necessary to define the subject. The concept of a triangle, for instance, contains the predicates a shape with three sides, a shape whose interior angles total 180 degrees, and so on. In this way, concepts for Leibniz are not merely signs, symbols, or mental images, but structured entities composed of predicates. A complete concept of an individual substance includes all the predicates that are true of that substance, such that if a predicate is included in a subject's complete concept, then the proposition asserting this predicate is necessarily true. Since the relational predicate 3 plus 5 is included within the complete concept of the number 8, the proposition 3 plus 5 equals 8 must be necessarily true. Thus, truths about the world, for Leibniz, are ultimately reducible to logical relations between concepts, with every fact about the world being logically determined by the complete concepts of substances. However, Leibniz did concede that there is a difference between necessary truths, such as 3 plus 5 being 8, or a triangle being a shape with three sides, and contingent truths, which are predicates that happen to belong to a subject, but this could have been otherwise. He argues, though, that only rational inquiry, not empirical observation, can establish necessary truths. Empirical observation does not provide complete knowledge, since experience alone cannot account for the underlying reasons for things, and, much in the same vein as Descartes, he held sensory data to be prone to error because the senses can deceive us. In fact, the implications of Leibniz's rationalism are actually quite severe, since the concept of a subject contains all properties that can be predicated of it. The rational analysis of a concept is all that is required to know everything true of it, even contingent truths, or, it would be, were our intellect not finite and limited. As influential a figure as Leibniz may have been for the rationalist school of thought, the theorist whose work was just as seminal for the school of empiricism was the English Enlightenment philosopher David Hume. Hume's approach to concepts, which, of course, holds that all concepts originate from sensory experience, is a psychological theory of sorts concerning how the human mind forms and manipulates concepts. He firstly differentiates between impressions, which are the direct, vivid, and forceful raw experiences that arise from sensation or reflection, and concepts, which are weaker, less vivid mental representations of impressions. Hume argues that all concepts begin as copies of impressions, and thus no idea can exist unless it is ultimately derived from an impression, which is to say traced back to sensory experiences. Even abstract concepts can be accounted for in Hume's system as products of a process of generalization from particular experiences. The concept of a triangle can be the product of a collection of past impressions of different triangles we have seen, a generalization occasioned by our noticing similarities among these impressions. In a manner similar to Hobbes, Hume also suggests that we use general terms to group together similar impressions based on custom and habit. The formulation of complex concepts can arise from the utilization of specific associative mechanisms that organize and link these grouped impressions. He identified three such fundamental principles of association: resemblance, concepts that resemble each other tend to be associated; congruity, concepts that occur together in space and time are linked; and cause and effect. When one impression is consistently followed by another, the mind forms an expectation of causation. In this way, even a concept as complex as justice can be accounted for as having emerged from associating past experiences of fair and unfair actions. The implications of Hume's empiricism are as severe as were the implications of Leibniz's rationalism, since Hume's system calls into question the necessity of the truth of certain key concepts that rationalists hold up as proof positive of their school of thought. The necessity of self-existence, which Descartes so famously declared, is dismissed by Hume as no more than an illusion. He argues that when we introspect, we find only a bundle of fleeting perceptions and experiences, never a single, stable, unchanging, and unified self. Similarly, with respect to the concept of causation, which seems to be a necessary consequence of what Leibniz called the principle of sufficient reason, that nothing happens without a reason, Hume argues that we never directly perceive causation itself, only the succession of events. The concept of cause and effect is therefore a habit of the mind, not a necessary truth about the world or rational insight. Hume would go on to cast doubt on the meaning and verifiability of other concepts that have traditionally been the focus of philosophical inquiry, such as substance and free will, since they appear to depend on assumptions that go beyond what experience can justify and therefore cannot be derived from impressions. Hume's contribution to the Western philosophical tradition was hugely influential, if only due to the motivation it stimulated in future theorists to critique, clarify, and refute his assertions. One such theorist was Immanuel Kant, whose work we were introduced to in the previous episode. We will be revisiting Kant's contribution not only because of how directly impacted it was by the theories of both Leibniz and Hume, but more so because Kant's project was an attempt to bridge the divide between rationalism and empiricism, a debate concerning the intrinsic nature of concepts. Listeners should revisit the portion of the previous episode that details Kant's theory of ideas for a more thorough exposition of what his work had to say, but as a brief summary of it for our present purposes, you will recall that Kant differentiated between two types of idea: those that arise as a consequence of experience, products of sensory data, and those that amount to the conditions for the possibility of experience, innate mental faculties that categorize and structure sensory data. It is this second type of idea, categories of the mind that are necessary for experience, that we will be exploring in more depth in this episode. Kant argues that there are certain concepts that we cannot simply apply to experience after it has occurred, because they belong to the understanding and serve to organize and structure the intuitions we acquire by means of sensory experience in order to make experience coherent. As such, without these concepts, which are innate structures of human cognition, the sensory world would remain chaotic and unintelligible. He identifies 12 fundamental concepts of the understanding and places them in one of 4 groups. Concepts of quality govern whether we perceive objects as singularities or pluralities. Concepts of quality determine whether something is present, absent, or limited in our experience. Concepts of relation structure how objects interact, which is to say, causality. And concepts of modality define whether objects are possible, actual, or necessary. These categories are not derived from experience, in the way Hume suggests they need to be. Rather, their status as conditions for the possibility of experience is emergent from the fact that our perception of multiple sensations from the external world manifests within our mind as a unified, coherent experience. Likewise, neither can it be that these concepts are meaningful in the absence or independence of experience, in the way Leibniz suggests that they can be, because it is from the fact that experience appears to be structured in particular ways that these concepts play a role in human cognition. At one level, Kant's concepts of the understanding establish a philosophical justification for objective scientific knowledge. Any reliance on events being governed by causal laws, which is central to practically all scientific inquiry, gains justification from the category of causality, and the assumption of objects persisting through time gains justification from the category of substance. Mathematical truths too, such as those of geometry and arithmetic, are held to be necessary because of how they define space and time respectively, although we ought not to stray too far into this aspect of Kant's system. However, Kant also writes of a set of concepts that arise from pure reason alone and account for the possibility of the highest forms of human cognition, that which seeks to attain totality and completeness in knowledge, guiding our thinking beyond the limits of possible perception. Whilst reason generates these concepts in its desire to attain completeness, Kant argues that these concepts cannot actually constitute knowledge, given that they do not correspond to objects of possible experience. Rather, they ought to be taken to have an important regulative function, as useful guides to unify and systematize empirical knowledge and human inquiry. For instance, the concept of the soul helps us unify psychological phenomena, such as the thinking self, and the concept of the universe as a whole, as opposed to the discrete segments of it that appear to us in instances of experience, encourages scientific investigation. The relevance of the rationalist-empiricist debate to our current exploration of the notion of a concept is neatly summarized by Kant's project to define the role and limits of speculative reason. Competing schools of thought in early modern Western philosophy differed in their accounts of the extent to which the faculty of reason could be credited for the proliferation of some, or indeed the totality, of the mental constructs we call concepts. Although, as I mentioned earlier, there is now a broad scholarly acceptance that rationalism and empiricism both have explanatory power in understanding concepts, the underlying question of whether rational inquiry can transcend the limits of our empirical nature still looms over conceptual analysis in modern times. Part 3. Theological Traditions. We ought to pause for a moment and appreciate the fact that human beings are capable of forming mental representations at all is as perplexing as it is astonishing. As captivated and confounded by this quality of reality as philosophers may have been, it proved as much an area of scholarly attention for theologians. From the previous episode, listeners will recall that the theological accounts of human experience that were being developed in the Middle East, relating to the so-called Abrahamic religions, were hugely influenced by the work of Plato and Aristotle. As we will soon learn, the philosophical systems and theoretical machinery that these Greek philosophers innovated were of tremendous benefit to theologians in reconciling theological doctrine with the rigorous and systematic exposition of human experience that had been advocated for by pioneers of philosophical inquiry such as Socrates. It was inevitable that this would be the case, given that philosophy and theology are, in their own way, attempting to ascertain what is true, the topic of a forthcoming episode. Thus, our exploration of what is meant by the notion of a concept would not be complete were we not to consider how the term is understood in various theological traditions, or at least those traditions for whom abstract mental representations actually have some meaning. Previously, we looked at the work of Abu Nasr al-Farabi as an example of Islamic philosophical scholarship in terms of the theory of ideas, which drew heavy influence from the work of Plato. It would have been just as apt to have examined the work of another titan of Islamic scholarship, the immediate intellectual successor of al-Farabi, who, arguably, was more influential, at least in the Western world of the time, the Persian philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, or, to give him his Latinized name, Avicenna. Avicenna defines a concept as something intelligible that exists in the mind after being abstracted from particular instances. In a manner similar to Plato and al-Farabi before him, Avicenna contends that concepts do not exist independently in the external world, but only in the intellect as universal representations of reality. To this end, Avicenna maintains that universals exist in three modes: in the external world, as instantiated particulars, in the mind, as abstracted concepts, and in the divine intellect, as eternal and independent entities akin to Plato's forms. However, the role of abstraction in Avicenna's theory is clearly inspired by Aristotle, given his account of the formation of concepts. Avicenna identifies three stages in the formation of concepts: sense perception, where the external senses perceive material objects and their particular qualities; then the imagination retains an image or phantasm of the perceived object; and finally the intellect, or more precisely, the active intellect, abstracts the universal essence from the particular, producing a concept. This system should be familiar to listeners who recall the theory of ideas developed by Averroes, which was detailed in the last episode. What marks out Avicenna's system, however, is his distinction between essence and existence, an element of his theory that attempts to differentiate between the origin of mental representations and their intrinsic nature, a move that would go on to have significant impact in theological scholarship following him in both Judaism and Christianity. Avicenna argues that concepts represent essences which are neutral regarding their existence in reality. For instance, the concept of triangle captures its essence, whether or not an actual triangle exists. In other words, Avicenna believed that existence is not an intrinsic property of essence. He contends that while an essence, such as a triangle or even humanity, can be conceived in the mind without reference to existence, its actual existence in the real world depends on something external, either necessity by itself, as in the case of God, or possible existence if caused by another, as in the case of contingent beings. This, of course, entails a third variety of interrelationship between essence and existence, something whose essence necessitates non-existence, such as a square triangle, an impossible existence, as it were. The language of essence and accident, which was innovated by Avicenna, is still used in philosophical literature to the present day. The importance of Avicenna's work to subsequent theological thought is undeniable, as we will shortly learn, beginning with the work of a contemporary of Averroes of Andalusia, the astronomer, physician, and Sephardic rabbi Moses ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides. The reference to Averroes is purposefully made here because, much like his contemporary, Maimonides was clear in his desire to adapt Aristotle's philosophical work in a way that cohered with Jewish theological principles, and was less persuaded by Plato's non-material account of ideas, which also distinguishes him from Avicenna. For Maimonides, concepts are mental constructs that enable humans to engage with reality, yet they are limited by human perception and intellect. In his view, knowledge comes in two primary varieties: empirical knowledge, which is derived from sensory experience and observation, and intellectual knowledge, which is formed through abstraction and reason, allowing for an understanding of universal truths. From here, he adopts Avicenna's progression of the formulation of concepts, essentially verbatim. Perception collects sensory data, the imagination stores and manipulates it, and finally the active intellect extracts universals from particulars. Because Maimonides rejected an immaterial reality to concepts, in the way Philo of Alexandria had once theorized, concepts are held to have no existence beyond the human mind. However, because of the limits of human perception and intellect, Maimonides goes on to question whether human beings can ever have true knowledge of the divine reality of God. Maimonides is perhaps most famous for his doctrine of negative theology, which asserts that, because human concepts can never accurately describe God, any positive attributes ascribed to God must be merely metaphorical or negations of limitations. So, for instance, saying God is wise equates to no more than saying God lacks ignorance, rather than any claim that God possesses the concept of wisdom in the sense that human beings understand this latter term. Because human cognition is bound by material and finite constraints, Maimonides argues that conceptual knowledge is inherently limited when applied to God, with the sole exception of one species of knowledge that enables human concepts to attain a higher level of understanding as a consequence of divine illumination, prophetic knowledge. Prophetic knowledge surpasses rational abstraction and is characterized by direct apprehension of divine truths, albeit still limited by the fact that prophetic knowledge is mediated through human faculties. In this way, Maimonides attempts to reconcile his theory of concepts, inspired by Aristotle's repudiation of the immaterial, and Jewish theology, which ascribes great importance to divine revelation. And yet, to separate himself from purely mystical accounts of prophecy that existed within the theological tradition, Maimonides suggests that the prophets possessed exceptionally developed intellects, enhanced by divine inspiration, allowing for deep comprehension of divine principles, and refined imaginative faculties that enabled the translation of these abstract truths into accessible visions and teachings. The contributions of Avicenna and Maimonides to theological scholarship, inspired by the philosophical systems of Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle, would go on to influence Christian theologians throughout the Middle Ages. One especially prominent figure to examine in this regard is the Italian Dominican priest and scholastic thinker Thomas Aquinas. Just like Avicenna, Aquinas characterizes concepts as mental representations formed through intellectual abstraction, and just like Maimonides, he holds that concepts of universals exist rooted in the reality of things themselves, either in things, awaiting abstraction, or in the intellect, following abstraction, but not in a separate, immaterial realm. The influence of Avicenna and Maimonides can also be seen in Aquinas' account of the formation of concepts, the roles of the active and passive intellect, his distinction between essence and existence, as well as the contention that, since God's nature is beyond full human comprehension, human concepts can describe God only by analogy. Of course, the importance of Aquinas' work relates to the implications it had for Christian theological thought and the consequences for Christian doctrine of his attempt to reconcile it with a system originally developed by Aristotle. Whilst accepting the limits of human cognition and reason, Aquinas still believes that human beings are capable of grasping truths through abstraction and logical reasoning, even if divine grace is needed to elevate human understanding, particularly in matters of faith and theology. For example, while he holds that concepts formed by reason can lead to knowledge of God's existence, faith is required for knowledge of divine mysteries, such as the Trinity. Similarly, whilst he emphasizes that natural reason can form concepts about God, divine revelation provides truths that exceed human intellectual capacity, allowing for the possibility of scripture and tradition to contain knowledge that the human intellect by itself could not contain. Thus, Aquinas' system is a mechanism for unifying, within a Christian context, concepts generated by human cognition, mediated by empirical experience, and those relating to theological knowledge, facilitated by divine revelation, providing a philosophical foundation of sorts for Christian doctrine. Part 4. Contemporary Analytic Philosophy. Following the Age of Enlightenment, which featured the rationalist-empiricist debate, and entering into the 20th century, Western philosophy saw a difference of opinion amongst theorists with respect to how to address fundamental philosophical problems. Some favored logical analysis and more formal argumentation akin to the scientific method, whilst others were interested in broader social, political, literary, and historical analysis, wishing to explore the nature of human experience. The first of these methodological approaches has been labeled the analytic school of philosophy because of its emphasis on formal analysis, logically and scientifically. The other, which often questions the objectivity of science and reason itself, and engaged in interdisciplinary projects spanning literature, psychology, and sociology, has been labeled the continental school of philosophy because of its development in continental Europe, principally by French and German theorists. Both of these methodological traditions had insights to examine with regards to the intrinsic nature of concepts, so we shall attend to some representative theories from them in turn. A leading figure in analytic philosophy, considered by many to be its founding theorist, was the German logician and mathematician Friedrich Ludwig Gottlob Frege. Frege's theory of concepts stems from the formal system he created to ground modern logic, which distinguishes between function and argument. His primary goal was to develop a formal language that could precisely express logical and mathematical truths in order to avoid paradoxes and ensure the clarity of logical expressions. Frege argues that concepts and objects belong to different logical categories. Objects, Gegenstände, are complete entities that can stand as subjects in logical propositions, for example the number 2, the moon, or Julius Caesar. In contrast, concepts, Begriffe, are incomplete or unsaturated entities that require arguments to form a complete thought. For example, the concept being a prime number is not an object, but something that applies to objects, like the numbers 2, 3, or 5. This simple distinction avoids category mistakes, such as treating numbers as physical entities or predicates as subjects. Frege's subsequent function-argument analysis of logic underpins his theory of concepts. He conceives of concepts as functions that take arguments and yield truth values, true or false. His analysis allows him to formalize mathematical and logical relations in a precise manner. A function, in Frege's sense, is unsaturated, meaning it requires an argument to become a complete expression. For example, in the proposition 2 is a prime number, the function, concept, being a prime number, applies to the argument the number 2, yielding the truth value, true. From this position, Frege proceeded to introduce the distinction between sense, Sinn, and reference, Bedeutung. The reference, Bedeutung, of an expression is the object or truth value it denotes. The sense, Sinn, is the mode of presentation of the reference. For example, the morning star and the evening star both refer to the planet Venus as their Bedeutung, but they have different meanings. In relation to concepts, the sense of a concept determines how it is understood, while its reference is its extension, or the set of objects it applies to. This distinction is crucial for explaining why identity statements provide information and for understanding how language conveys meaning. Frege's system, however, has limitations. Firstly, his strict separation of concepts and objects, whereby he argues that a concept cannot be an object, leads to the difficulty of accounting for why we refer to them in sentences like the concept of a number is important in mathematics. Secondly, although it is not necessary for present purposes to understand why, Frege's system can lead to contradictions if concepts are treated as sets of things and these sets are designed to be self-referential. For such reasons, Frege's contemporaries in analytic philosophy, although decidedly inspired by his work, sought to modify and refine his system whilst adhering to the spirit of his approach. The British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell was one such figure, whose theory of concepts is as consequential for logic and mathematics as it is for language and the study of knowledge. To understand Russell's theory, we must first understand how Russell believed we refer to objects in our use of language. Russell distinguishes between definite descriptions, which are descriptions specifying a unique entity, for example, the current King of France, and indefinite descriptions, descriptions of an entity without specifying uniqueness, for example, a king. Russell's theory proposes that descriptions do not function as names, but instead as quantified expressions. For instance, the phrase, "the present King of France is bald," can be reformulated to be saying, "there is one and only one present King of France, and that entity is bald." Naturally, if there is no such entity, which is the case in this instance, since there is presently no King of France, then the statement is false, which avoids problems of non-existent reference. Russell's analysis implies that many traditional philosophical discussions about concepts are based on mistaken assumptions. Instead of treating concepts as abstract entities, Russell sees them as logical constructs that emerge from the structure of propositions. His analysis reshapes our understanding of concepts, suggesting that many apparent references to concepts are actually disguised logical structures. Russell would proceed from this foundation to describe two categories of knowledge: that which we gain by acquaintance, which is direct awareness of objects or simple properties, for example, our awareness of colors and our sense data, and that which we gain by description, which is indirect knowledge of objects we have not directly encountered but can describe using definite or indefinite descriptions, for example, the podcast Ideology Explained. Concepts that we grasp through acquaintance are fundamental, forming the building blocks of all knowledge. More complex concepts arise from descriptions based on logical constructions. This distinction suggests that not all concepts are of the same kind. Some concepts correspond directly to simple objects of acquaintance, while others are merely shorthand for logical constructions. Russell's approach avoids any commitment to abstract concepts as immaterial entities, grounding them in cognitive and linguistic structures. Unlike Frege, who maintained that concepts are unsaturated and cannot function as objects, Russell argues that concepts could, under certain conditions, be treated as logical constructs. Despite their differences, however fine, Frege and Russell's respective theories still treat concepts as mind-dependent mental representations. Later contributors to the school of analytic philosophy would challenge this point of view by presenting a more externalist understanding of the intrinsic nature of concepts. For the American philosopher and computer scientist Hilary Putnam, the meaning of concepts are not determined solely by psychological states or internal cognitive structures. To explain his argument that meaning is not determined solely by internal cognitive states, but also depends on external environmental factors, Putnam developed a now famous thought experiment, which is a mental exercise intended to test hypotheses or explore scenarios. He called it Twin Earth. Imagine a planet identical to Earth in every respect except for one crucial difference. Instead of water being H2O, the lakes, rivers, and oceans contain a different substance, X, Y, Z. Let us call this planet Twin Earth. The inhabitants of Twin Earth call their XYZ liquid water, just as we call our H2O liquid water on Earth. However, despite the identical use of the word, the chemical composition of the substance differs. According to traditional internalist theories of meaning, if the inhabitants of the two planets have the same mental images and associations when they think of water, then the word water should have the same meaning on both planets. However, Putnam argues that meaning is not just in the head, rather meaning is determined by external factors, specifically the chemical nature of the substance. The Twin Earth thought experiment demonstrates that meaning is partially determined by the external world and not just by mental representations, and that concepts are not merely mental constructs but are rooted in external reality. Putnam also introduces the notion of the division of linguistic labor in the formation of concepts, by which he explains how individuals rely on experts for precise definitions of concepts. In the Twin Earth thought experiment, for example, scientific experts from each planet would have determined that the nature of the substance that they call water was different. This notion challenges the traditional view that every speaker fully possesses the meaning of the words they use. The average speaker may use the word salt correctly, without knowing that they are specifying a particular chemical compound, sodium chloride, or that any ionically neutral compound can be called salt. However, people would need to refer to chemists who possess expert knowledge in this area if they wanted to learn about the properties of salt. This division of linguistic labor ensures that language remains stable even though individual speakers may have only partial understanding of certain concepts. It also suggests that the meaning of a concept is not fixed solely by individual cognitive states, but is distributed across a linguistic community. Experts help to define and refine concepts, ensuring consistency in scientific and technical discourse, and concepts in turn evolve over time as scientific knowledge advances, altering how terms are understood. Because this theory could lead to a problem of conceptual relativity, where different conceptual schemes lead to different understandings of reality, Putnam argues against radical relativism while acknowledging that conceptual schemes influence how we describe the world. Putnam uses the example of a simple cup. Should we say that the cup is a single object, or should we consider it a sum of its parts, atoms and molecules? The answer depends on the conceptual framework we adopt. However, Putnam argues that this does not lead to radical relativism. Rather, some conceptual choices are more pragmatically useful than others. A pragmatist approach to concepts and an emphasis on the practical use of concepts in everyday reasoning and scientific inquiry was therefore central to Putnam's theory. Rather than viewing concepts as fixed entities with precise definitions, Putnam saw them as useful tools that serve practical purposes. Thus, concepts for Putnam are not static, but evolve based on practical considerations and scientific progress. The final theory we will examine in this part on analytic philosophy is the representational theory of mind, one of the leading advocates of which was the American philosopher and cognitive scientist Jerry Fodor. Representational theory of mind holds that mental processes operate as symbolic representations, such that concepts are mental representations that function similarly to words in a language. Thinking, therefore, involves manipulating these mental representations according to the same rules as languages use to construct sentences. This way of characterizing concepts led Fodor to develop the language of thought hypothesis, which claims that thoughts occur in an internal language, sometimes called mentalese. According to Fodor, concepts are constituents of mentalese, and their meaning is determined by their causal relations to the world. The language of thought hypothesis posits that thought consists of structured, discrete symbols, similar to how natural languages have a grammar and syntax. Fodor argued that mental representations, concepts, function like words and sentences in a natural language, and the mind has an innate syntactic structure, which refers to how words ought to be ordered, that enables thought and cognition. Concept acquisition, therefore, involves linking mental symbols to objects in the external world, rather than constructing concepts from sensory experience. Fodor's language of thought hypothesis provides an account of how concepts can combine to form complex thoughts, supporting a school of thought called compositionality, which is the notion that meaning of a complex expression is determined by the meanings of its parts and their arrangement. Listeners will hopefully have detected the influence of thinkers such as Hobbes and Kant in this account of the nature of concepts. The representational theory of mind can be traced back to Hobbes and the early varieties of empiricism that we have considered over the course of these two episodes. Fodor's innovation was to couple it to the language of thought hypothesis, which clearly shares many similarities with Kant's account of categories of the understanding. For instance, according to Fodor, concepts are not derived from experience, but are instead pre-wired into the cognitive architecture of the mind. He argued that core concepts such as object, cause, number, and belief are part of an innate cognitive structure. Fodor actually makes a far stronger claim that many, if not all, concepts are innate in the mind, rather than learned, making his theory a rationalist account of the nature of concepts, using classically empiricist machinery for the formation of knowledge. Needless to say, Fodor's stronger claim is highly controversial and has been widely criticized. Nevertheless, it does provide a neat reminder that our understanding of ideas is part of an intellectual tradition to which many have contributed, and so new contributions can be considered a continuation of narratives commenced by our intellectual predecessors, motivated by either concurrence with or divergence from what came before. Part 5. Contemporary Continental Philosophy. The school of continental philosophy is extremely varied in terms of the types of philosophical inquiries and scholarly work that can be categorized as falling within it. Continental philosophy is so broad in not only the topics it engages with, but also the diversity of intellectual systems it gave rise to, that entire episodes of this series could be dedicated to just one of the systems within this school. Therefore, we will limit our exploration of continental philosophy to just 4 theorists for the purposes of this part of this episode on what is meant by the term concept, each one representing a different philosophical system, those being phenomenology, existentialism, structuralism, and critical theory. Phenomenology is a philosophical movement aimed at exploring the structures of consciousness and the intentional nature of experience, and the theorist credited as its founder is the Austrian-German philosopher and mathematician Edmund Husserl. Husserl's theory of concepts departs significantly from traditional empiricist and rationalist accounts by emphasizing the intentional acts of consciousness in constituting meaning, arguing that concepts emerge through intentionality, which is the fundamental directness of consciousness toward objects. His departure from both of the traditions that dominated the Age of Enlightenment is due to their perceived failure to account for how concepts are given in consciousness. As you will recall, empiricists reduced concepts to essentially psychological generalizations, while rationalists treated them as fixed structures. Phenomenology, Husserl's proposed alternative, in contrast sought to describe the essential structures of consciousness as they are lived and experienced. Central to Husserl's system is the notion of intentionality, which refers to the directness of consciousness. Every act of thinking, perceiving, or imagining is always about something. In other words, consciousness is never empty. It is always related to an intentional object. As such, concepts are constituted by intentional acts and are given in lived experience. For example, the concept triangle is not simply a mental image, as Hume thought of it, or a set of necessary conditions, as Leibniz thought of it, but is something grasped in an act of intuition. What Husserl means by intuition is a mental process which allows us to identify the essential structures of concepts by stripping away contingent aspects. This process is a reductive one, which consists of free variation. We imaginatively alter aspects of an object to discover what is essential to its identity. Returning to our example of the concept of triangle, we can imagine various modifications, such as equilateral, isosceles, and right-angled triangle, until eventually we arrive at the essential structure of triangle. In this way, Husserl argues that concepts are not merely linguistic constructs, but essential structures grasped in intuition. Phenomenology has been quite influential in the years since its development, so much so, in fact, that it impacted the development of scholarly work in other systems of continental philosophy, particularly the system that came to be known as existentialism. It is perhaps better to examine a representative theory in the wake of phenomenology rather than any of those theories that predate phenomenology, but have been assigned the descriptive label existentialist, perhaps more for organizational convenience than ideological synergy. Therefore, we shall examine the theory of no less than Husserl's own student, the German philosopher and humanist Martin Heidegger. Whereas phenomenology is a method and philosophical approach primarily concerned with describing and analyzing conscious experience as it appears, without presuppositions, existentialism attempts to understand the meaning of individual human existence and how we confront the absurdity of life and live authentically rather than conforming to societal roles. Heidegger himself, over the course of his academic career, actually transitions from an understanding of concepts rooted in phenomenology to one that is more existentialist in nature. His rejection of both empiricism and rationalism follows a similar line of argument to that proposed in phenomenology. However, he also criticizes phenomenology for failing to recognize the fact that concepts are grounded in what he refers to as being in the world, which is to say, they emerge from our engagement with the world. This notion of being in the world, the insight that a human being's practical encounter with the world accounts for the origin of concepts, places emphasis on the practical and pragmatic nature of concepts, such that concepts are not first grasped in isolation, but rather through use, action, and social interaction. A craftsman, for instance, does not primarily understand a hammer as an abstract concept, but instead as a tool that they can use within a practical context. In consequence of this, Heidegger argues that the understanding of concepts is always historically and culturally conditioned rather than universally fixed. Concepts, as a result, do not merely mirror reality, but they participate in uncovering or revealing different ways of being, existing, and interacting with the world. Listeners should by now, over the course of these past 2 episodes, have noticed a pattern in the development of schools of thought. The rise of one way of characterizing an idea leading to either a refinement of that original system or else a rejection of it in favor of an alternative. The system resulting from Russell's refinement of Frege was subsequently challenged by Putnam in the School of Analytic Philosophy, for instance. A similar eventuality can be seen to have occurred in continental philosophy, with Heidegger's existentialist expansion of Husserl's focus on human experience being challenged by the philosophical system known as structuralism. Theorists who advocated structuralism believed that existentialism placed far too much emphasis on individual freedom while ignoring deep structures that shape thought. They believed existentialism romanticized personal choice while neglecting the role of linguistic and cultural codes. Whereas existentialism argues that we are radically free to create meaning despite external influences, structuralism contends that we are shaped by pre-existing systems, whether linguistic, social, or unconscious. A leading figure in the development of structuralism was the Swiss linguist and philosopher Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure's theory of concepts relates to linguistic signs and the arbitrary nature of linguistic meaning. With respect to a sign, he defines this as a 2-part entity, a signifier, which is the physical form of a word or symbol, for example, the sound of the word tree or its written representation, and the signified, which is the concept or mental representation associated with the signifier, for example, the mental image or construct of a tree. Saussure goes on to argue that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. There is no inherent connection between the word tree and the object it represents. Instead, meaning arises through social convention and linguistic structures, being determined by historical and cultural agreement. Since words do not have an inherent link to their meaning, they function only within a system of linguistic differences, which shifts the focus from individual words to the system that gives them meaning. Concepts, therefore, do not exist in isolation, but acquire significance through their differences and oppositions within a language system. They are defined not by what they are, but how they differ from other concepts. For example, the meaning of day is understood in opposition to night, and the concept of cat is understood by differentiating it from other animals like dog or seagull. The subsequent relationship between concepts and how they function in sentences shows that concepts acquire meaning through their position within a structure rather than through their individual essence. Because language has an underlying structured system of rules that governs meaning and communication, Saussure argued that concepts cannot be private mental constructs because they are socially and structurally determined. The rules of language shape how concepts are used and understood within a given linguistic community, and individual contextual instances of speech or writing must conform with these rules in order to have meaning. The notion that concepts do not exist in a vacuum but are shaped by material conditions, such as social and economic structures and the unfolding of history, was a proposition taken very seriously by a philosophical movement that came to be known as critical theory. This movement held that if it is the case that power structures and systems of domination shape human experience, then philosophical inquiry, or even academic theory more broadly, should not merely be concerned with interpreting the world, but it ought to actively work to change it. Because critical theory is an interdisciplinary school of thought, combining work in philosophy, sociology, and psychology, we will restrict our examination of it to just the contribution of the theorist regarded as establishing its intellectual foundations, the German philosopher and economist Karl Marx. Marx was inspired by Hegel's theory of ideas, which we examined in the previous episode, that understood the development of ideas to be part of an autonomous process that unfolds throughout history, but he rejected the immaterial characterization of ideas within Hegel's system. According to Marx, concepts reflect the social and economic base, meaning that they are shaped by class structures and material conditions, and the frameworks that give rise to them emerge from the mode of production, which is the way society organizes labor, resources, and economic relations. Marx rejected the notion that concepts develop in a purely intellectual sphere, arguing instead that they are formed through practical activity, praxis. He believed that thought is not separate from action, such that concepts gain meaning through their relation to labor, production, and social struggles. In a similar way to Hegel's dialectic, Marx held that concepts develop through contradictions, conflicts, and historical processes, which is to say that concepts do not remain static but evolve through struggles and oppositions. In fact, the term ideology, in the sense that Marx uses it, serves to explain how dominant ideas, including conceptual frameworks, justify and maintain existing power structures. He believed that concepts such as justice, democracy, and equality are often used to maintain the status quo rather than reflect universal truths. Marx would go on to apply his theory of concepts to critique political economy, demonstrating how economic categories are not neutral but historically contingent. Whereas classical economists such as Adam Smith treated concepts like labor, capital, and value as natural economic laws, Marx showed that these concepts are historically specific to capitalism. Capital, Marx argued, is not merely a thing, such as money or machinery, but a social relation between classes. As a consequence of his theory, Marx argued that concepts are not merely objects of contemplation, but tools for social change. Because concepts are not fixed, but historically evolving, changing through class struggle and revolutionary movements, Marx believed that intellectuals can play a role in developing new concepts that challenge dominant ideologies, leading to the possibility of change if these new concepts are accompanied with active engagement with the world, which is to say, organized action. It is important to understand this aspect of Marx's theory, an idea called revolutionary praxis, putting theory into action by means of revolutionary mass movement, because it helps to explain many events in modern history, as well as ongoing and emerging movements in the modern world. Quite fitting, this should be the case, given the goal of the school of continental philosophy is to engage with history and culture in order to understand human experience. Part 6. The study of concepts in cognitive science. In the final part of this episode on the meaning of the term concept, we shall turn our attention to the modern interdisciplinary field of cognitive science, which draws together academic work undertaken in fields such as psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and computer science, in order to create research that furthers our understanding of topics such as memory or consciousness, which is of practical benefit to the development of topics such as learning and artificial intelligence. To this end, we will examine 3 representative theories that have been particularly influential in framing our modern understanding of human cognition, and thereby the meaning of the term concept. These are prototype theory, exemplar theory, and the somewhat confusingly named theory theory, which essentially characterizes concepts as informal scientific theories. However, before proceeding directly to examining these theories, some note must be made of the work of a theorist whose contribution to the school of analytic philosophy set the groundwork for modern thinking in cognitive science. After all, with its emphasis on logical and scientific analysis, analytic philosophy would appear to provide an harmonious theoretical foundation upon which research in cognitive science could be based. And yet, because of the work of the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, it became apparent that the analysis of concepts was not quite as straightforward as simply deconstructing a fixed logical structure of basic building blocks of thought. Wittgenstein's insight was the realization that rigid definitions, which attempt to capture the essence of a concept, fail to explain the flexibility and dynamism with which some concepts are used in everyday language. Wittgenstein, who actually studied under Bertrand Russell, began his academic career broadly in agreement with the approach to concepts advocated by Frege and Russell, which we considered earlier. However, in a manner similar to the way in which Heidegger deviated from his teacher Husserl, Wittgenstein, in his later years, realized that imposing an overly rigid formal structure on language does not accurately reflect how language functions in practice. Language, he would go on to argue, does not consist of a fixed set of elementary propositions, but rather adapts, evolves, and functions in many ways that do not reduce to what could be called logical atoms. This insight led to him suggesting that meaning is not a function of a fixed logical structure, but is instead determined by the way words are used in different language games, with words acquiring meaning in the specific contexts in which they are employed. The language games approach serves to illustrate that meaning is tied to specific forms of life and activities, making language an inherently social activity, such that concepts gain significance through their application within shared linguistic practices. A concept's meaning, therefore, is not fixed by reference to objects, but emerges from how it is used in practice, with different language games employing concepts in different ways, meaning that no single essence underlies a concept. Wittgenstein's appeal to a language games characterization of concepts stems from his view that some concepts lack a single defining characteristic, an essence, as it were, but instead share overlapping similarities, more akin to family resemblance than a fixed essence. Just as members of a family may share features like hair color or facial structure without all possessing a single defining trait, concepts, Wittgenstein argues, can exhibit overlapping similarities without a singular, universally shared, fixed essence. Wittgenstein himself cites the concept of a game as an example of a concept without a fixed essence, but with many examples that have overlapping similarities. The games of chess and football, for instance, are both competitive and adhere to a strict set of rules, but were we to ask which is more similar to tennis, we could make arguments on behalf of either, since both chess and tennis are designed to be games played between two players, and football is designed to involve teams, whereas both tennis and football demand significant levels of physical activity, whilst chess does not. The implication of Wittgenstein's family resemblance model is that the meaning of a concept is determined by patterns of usage rather than by a strict definition. Understanding a concept, therefore, is not a matter of defining it explicitly, but of knowing how to apply it in practice, given that meaning is inherently social, emerging from human activities and interactions rather than from an abstract system of representation. Moreover, since language is embedded in what Wittgenstein calls forms of life, the shared cultural and social contexts that shape linguistic practices, different communities or disciplines may have distinct ways of using concepts, reflecting their particular experiences and activities. This helps explain why concepts vary across cultures, as different societies develop unique conceptual frameworks suited to their specific needs, practices, and the traditions of that linguistic community. Wittgenstein highlights two important implications of his theory. Firstly, that there is no such thing as a private concept, one which is known only to an individual, because it would lack criteria for correct usage, and secondly, that concepts must be publicly accessible and regulated by communal agreement in order to function in language. The influence of Wittgenstein's contribution to analytic philosophy can be clearly detected in the cognitive science theories we are now going to examine, beginning with prototype theory, which was developed by the American psychologist Eleanor Rosch. Noticing the vagueness and graded way in which scientists categorize what they observe in the natural world, Rosch's theory suggests that membership within a given category is determined not by strict definitions, but by similarity to an ideal or most representative example, a prototypical member, as it were. She argues that categories have internal structures where some members are more central, prototypical, than others. For instance, when asked to rate how well an animal represents the category bird, participants in various research studies consistently rate robins and sparrows as more typical than ostriches and penguins. This could be because ostriches and penguins lack the ability to fly, which is a quality people typically associate with birds. Similarly, in the category furniture, chairs and sofas are considered more typical than wardrobes or shelves. As you can see, category members share a cluster of overlapping features, or family resemblance, rather than a strict set of defining attributes. Returning to the example of the category bird, whilst all birds have beaks, so do some species of mammal, such as the platypus and echidna, and even with respect to beaks, there is significant amount of variation amongst category members. The prototype, then, is often an abstracted or idealized version of the category, not necessarily an actual member of it, but one that represents the central tendencies of the category. Roche appeals to several areas of research to support this view of prototypes. For instance, in an experiment conducted where participants were asked to judge whether statements such as "a robin is a bird" was true or false, the results showed that people responded more quickly to sentences involving prototypical members than those involving atypical ones, such as "a penguin is a bird." In another study, Roche asked participants to rate how well different items represented their respective categories, and the findings revealed that certain members were consistently rated as more typical than others. Brain imaging studies also suggest that typical and atypical category members are processed differently. For instance, typical members activate category-specific brain regions more strongly than atypical members. Despite the evidence in its favor, prototype theory has faced criticism, most notably from proponents of the alternative exemplar theory. In the first instance, whilst prototype theory assumes that people represent categories using a single, abstracted best example, as in a prototype, opponents argue that categories often contain significant variability, which a single prototype fails to capture. Secondly, prototype theory struggles to explain how people correctly categorize atypical members of a category that are very different from the prototype, characterizing them as not a typical member of the category but still a member of it. Thirdly, prototype theory assumes that a single prototype represents a category for all contexts. However, categorization is often context dependent. A typical North American bird may differ from a typical Australian one, and prototypes do not easily change based on context. And finally, prototype theory assumes that categorization is based on similarity to, obviously, a prototype, but some categories are rules-based and do not rely on similarity. For instance, the concept of prime numbers in mathematics cannot be said to cohere with a typical member. In an effort to address these shortcomings, cognitive psychologists developed the alternative exemplar theory, which proposes that concepts are formed by storing and recalling individual instances or exemplars from memory, rather than relying on idealized average prototypes. Although a number of theorists can be credited for laying the foundations of exemplar theory, the theorist to whom it is arguably most closely associated is the American psychologist Robert Nossovsky. Nossovsky's research demonstrated that people often categorize objects based on specific prior experiences rather than generalizing them from an average prototype. As such, exemplar theory aligns with this view that memory plays a central role in cognition, as categorization is guided by stored examples rather than abstracted representations. Exemplar theory operates on several core principles. First, when encountering a new object, people compare it to multiple stored exemplars rather than relying on an abstract prototype. If a new object closely resembles a previously encountered example, it is categorized accordingly. Second, unlike prototype theory, which collapses category members into a single idealized representation, exemplar theory preserves variability. For example, the category bird, which we considered within the context of prototype theory, would include specific exemplars such as robin, sparrow, ostrich, and penguin, with each retaining its unique characteristics, rather than being concerned with why a penguin differs so much from the so-called typical bird prototype. Third, category membership is flexible and can change over time as new exemplars are added to memory. This explains why some members of a category, for instance atypical birds like penguins, are recognized despite not closely matching the prototypical example. Fourth, categorization can be influenced by the context in which exemplars were encountered. For example, someone living in a tropical region might categorize coconuts as a more typical fruit than someone from a temperate climate. And fifth, frequently encountered exemplars have a stronger influence on categorization than rare exemplars, which means that commonly seen members of a category are more likely to be used as reference points in classification. Much like prototype theory, Nosovsky is able to appeal to research to provide support for his theory. Earlier work by the psychologists Douglas Medin and Marguerite Schaefer demonstrated that people often make classification judgments based on specific past instances rather than an averaged prototype. In their experiments, participants were able to classify new stimuli more accurately when they resembled specific training examples. Nosovsky himself has showed that exemplar theory accounts for certain members of a category being recognized faster than others for reasons of frequency and recency of specific examples in memory. Studies using artificial category learning tasks show that participants rely on memory rather than abstracting an average category representation, with participants more likely to classify new instances based on resemblance to previous examples rather than general rules. Neuroimaging studies also suggest that the brain retains multiple exemplars for categorization. For instance, studies have shown that when individuals classify objects, multiple memory-related brain regions, such as the hippocampus, are activated, consistent with the idea that categorization is based on stored examples. Exemplar theory, therefore, explains learning patterns in individuals with cognitive impairments, with studies featuring individuals with hippocampal damage showing impaired categorization. Although they differ in some respects, empirical evidence suggests that people use a combination of exemplar-based and prototype-based categorization depending on the task and context. For this reason, some researchers propose a hybrid model where individuals rely on exemplars in early learning stages and shift to prototypes as categories become well defined. However, both prototype theory and exemplar theory appear unable to explain abstract categories such as justice, happiness, or even gravity, where individual prototypes or exemplars are not clearly defined. Both of these theories also rely on similarity-based categorization, but neither explains why category members share certain properties or why categories exist. Or to put it another way, we do not simply recognize robins, sparrows, and penguins as belonging to the category bird, we also understand why the category bird exists and why these animals are members of it. And both theories appear to assume that categorization is based on perceptual similarity, but research shows that people rely on causal reasoning rather than surface-level features. For instance, when participants in an experiment were told that a raccoon had been dyed to resemble a skunk, they categorized the animal as a raccoon despite it resembling a prototypical or exemplar skunk. For these reasons, another cognitive model was developed that suggests people form and use concepts in a way analogous to how scientists develop theories. This model, referred to as the theory of concepts, proposes that concepts are dynamic, theory-like structures that help explain and predict the world, and that these conceptual structures evolve over time as people acquire new information, revise their mental frameworks, and refine their understanding based on experience. This model emerged from the field of developmental psychology, which studies the progress of cognitive development over the course of a human lifespan, and was contributed to by many theorists, but none more significantly than the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Piaget's research relating to children's conceptual development demonstrated that young children organize their knowledge around causal explanations and revise their conceptual frameworks as they gain experience. Later studies would provide strong evidence for conceptual change, showing that children's understanding of biological concepts, such as alive, undergoes fundamental restructuring rather than simple accumulation of new examples. Consequently, theorists have characterized children as acting like little scientists, forming, testing, and revising conceptual theories. Theory posits that concepts are structured, dynamic, and explanatory. A child's concept of dog is not just has 4 legs and barks, but it also includes causal assumptions like dogs are animals that need food, can grow, and have internal organs. But these concepts are not fixed. They evolve as new evidence challenges old beliefs. For instance, a child's understanding of concepts such as alive and death changes with age and cultural background. And theory also provides an account of how some abstract concepts about the world come about. such as an intuitive understanding of objects being in motion or subject to gravity, and may even go some way to explaining why we believe those people who disagree with us are either uninformed or irrational. Much of the research evidence supporting the theory of concepts has been cited throughout the foregoing narrative, that conceptual learning involves fundamental restructuring rather than mere accumulation of facts, that category membership does not depend merely on external appearance, that children revise their beliefs when given counter-evidence, such as updating their understanding of object permanence in infancy, and that people's conceptual frameworks vary across cultures based on experience. In the end, theory attempts to argue that sometimes concepts are based on deeper causal relations, on underlying essence rather than external appearance, in contrast to the family resemblance-inspired prototype and exemplar theories. Proponents of those latter two theories would still argue that their respective theory better explains everyday categorization, since some simple concepts, such as chair and table, are defined more by function and use rather than by scientific theory-like reasoning, with the theory model imposing far too high a cognitive demand upon people. But perhaps the overall landscape of cognitive science has enough space to accommodate each of these theories within the context that enables them to best explain what is meant by the term concept. Closing remarks. That brings us to the end of this episode of Ideology Explained. A link to all the reference material used in the production of this episode can be found in the episode description. As I mentioned at the start, this episode is intended to be a companion to the first episode in the series, which explored the meaning of the term idea. If you have not already done so, I encourage you to listen to that episode, as it will provide some important perspective to the many themes that were explored in this episode. If I may resort, briefly, to using philosophical parlance, that first episode is in essence an introduction to metaphysics, the study of reality, whereas this episode is intended to be a broad overview of epistemology, the study of knowledge. For this reason, given the close relationship between metaphysics and epistemology, which was actually alluded to in the first episode, it is important that these two episodes are listened to in concert. I am very grateful to you for listening, and I hope you will be able to join me for the next episode. Thank you again, and take care.